Okay. Hi, everyone. Thank you, Vali, for the lovely presentation. Now I don't have to do it because I'm always really bad with presenting myself. But today I'll be talking to you about my research on anthropomorphism and the human-AI gap, or how it's kind of like implemented in human-AI interaction in particular, and no, that's in general, and then human-robot interaction in particular. So in one sentence, my research is about kind of exploring this, the dissonance that is created by the gap between the social and the technical facets of anthropomorphic AI agents, be that, you know, robots or any type of interaction, really. So kind of like as the name suggests, I started this very lengthy research. Took me 7 years. It was roughly around, I think it might have been a couple of months after Amazon launched the Amazon Echo. And I remember kind of witnessing how everything about it had gone viral. Like you had like thousands of spin-offs, parodies, like hundreds of online forums. You had like communities dedicated to discussions on its features. You had like thousands of customer and tech reviews in press and publications. And on one side, you had this view that it was kind of like the epitome of what domestic AI was meant to look like. And on the other side, you have like this idea that it was a Trojan horse, like meant to kind of like infiltrate the most intimate of our spheres, which was our homes. So I was really trying to understand where this kind of like polarized views were coming from. And I remember thinking that surely the human-like interaction metaphor was only complicating things, right? Because it was close to impossible to pinpoint where these dissonances were coming from. Because at one point you had a technological black box, which was the AI agent in itself, but you also had a cognitive black box, which was the anthropomorphic mental model, which there was no consensus on how it works. There still isn't. So all we knew was that, well, it's a great tool that solves the problem of social integration, but it creates other problems in the process. And there are many pro-arguments for why to use anthropomorphism, and I won't go over them, but I can't go over them. But one of the main ones in HRI was this idea that when we create something as human-like, it kind of like renders them as worthy of moral care and consideration. And this is, we see that happening a lot in robotics, but also we see it happening in debates on agency and morality, ranging from, I don't know, environmental consciousness to abortion rights, right? Like anthropomorphism is a really powerful tool. And it became actually a powerful tool in design, right? It was a psychological powerful tool that was very little understood. So despite it being very often used in HRI and HCI, the cognitive aspect of it remained somewhat unexplored, right? In a sense, that's quite justifiable because that's psychology's business. Why should we care? But even in psychology, there were debates over whether anthropomorphism, you'll hear me butcher the word a lot, and I do it more in writing. So whether anthropomorphism is a mindless social reaction or whether it has some sort of a complex human schema that comes with some predefined scripts of behavior. So you have on one side social sciences that see it as some sort of like mysterious cognitive phenomenon. And on the other side, you have like design and computer science and so that treat it like a design tool that essentially is that provides readily available mental models of interaction, which is another argument for why to use anthropomorphism. And that's called the intentional stance. Basically what that says is that we already know how to interact with humans, so let's just use that. And you say yes, but there's some, the fields of human-robot interaction and human-computer interaction kind of like stand somewhere in the middle. And they should have a formula for how to use anthropomorphism, right? No, it's still sometimes treated as a cognitive phenomenon, sometimes treated as a design tool. And this flexibility kind of like often leads to the false assumption that the two perfectly overlap, which only further kind of like obscures the mechanism at play. So I decided I was going to have to make a clear distinction between the conceptual model referred to as personification, so it's the deliberate act of prescribing a system with human-like qualities, and anthropomorphism, which I kept it as the cognitive process, and that refers to what we think a system does, which doesn't necessarily have to coincide with how a system is designed to be, right? And that's even more complicated on the background of kind of like having an anthropomorphic metaphor. And the need for this distinction was particularly important because with anthropomorphism, the complexity of it tends to seep to the cracks of like these two disjointed disciplines, which is computer science and social sciences. So I decided I was going to create my own interdisciplinary field, as one does. And I was going to have to look at this kind of intersection of social science and computer science, and look almost as like this idea of AI design, or look at the human AI as a object of study. But obviously I didn't arrive at this from the beginning. I wasn't so enlightened in my first year. And I actually looked at all these elements individually. And I had this really grand plan that I was going to study the cognitive phenomenon. So I was going to study the human and try to understand the perception. And then I realized that I was wrong. And then I moved on to kind of like the conceptual model. So I'm trying to understand the AI, or like the agent, whatever that is, or the robot. And that was also wrong. And 5 years later, I arrived at the conclusion that the act of trying to separate the two was reductionistic, because the locus of the interaction was not emerging from these two separate elements in isolation. And you've probably seen that also a lot today in Professor Trish's talk, where you actually can't separate elements into kind of like their isolated, contrived situations and predict something that would happen actually in the interaction. And that's how I decided I was going to look at the human AI as an object of study, which surprisingly enough hadn't been done. So I had to kind of create my own methodology for that. Right. So I will jump straight into the first failed assumption, which was that anthropomorphism is an entirely perceptive phenomenon. So I started looking at the human. And there is very few theoretical models for how we anthropomorphize things. And a lot of that is based on how we anthropomorph, or how we think of other people. But one very kind of like prominent theory on anthropomorphism in social sciences kind of like breaks down the anthropomorphic perception as being determined by these three factors. And they look scary, but in reality they are, they're very simple. And they predict that the degree to which we will anthropomorphize something will be determined by, first thing is called illicit agent knowledge. And in short, it means that, we know human mental models better than anything else. We know ourselves, we know other people. So until we kind of like acquire better mental models, we're just gonna resort to using anthropomorphic mental models as a basis of induction. So this means that with time, anthropomorphic mental models are meant to kind of dilute. So the better the more we acquire kind of like better suited mental models, then we would kind of like let go of the ones which do not predict the world as it is. Then the second one is effectance motivation, which kind of refers to this incentive to act effectively with our environment and to bypass uncertainty and unpredictability. And in short, kind of this predicts that the more we understand an environment, an agent or a robot, the less we would anthropomorphize it. And that sounds quite commonsensical, right? And the third one is, this is easy to understand, is sociability motivation, which says that if we are deprived of a sense of social belonging, we will start anthropomorphizing things. So if you feel lonely, you'll probably start anthropomorphizing things around your house. And so I decided to put this to a test with what turned out to be the bane of my existence, and that's virtual assistants. So in short, I was kind of hypothesizing these three predictions. The first one was that anthropomorphism would dilute over time as users kind of like manage to acquire better suited mental models. The second one was that the more users understood the backend technology, the less they would anthropomorphize it. Yes. And then the third one was that anthropomorphism and user satisfaction should be directly correlated. This being, again, another kind of like really big incentive for anthropomorphizing things in the first place, or personifying designs in the first place. So I had these hypotheses, and not sure what I was thinking, but I decided to kind of like launch what was meant to be a very quick qualitative study on Reddit. And it somehow ended up trending, so I had to take it down within 4 hours because I received 940 responses, which was 935 more than I expected. So I had a lot of data. And what I found was even more irritating because nothing made sense. So I found that anthropomorphism didn't vary at all over time, and in fact, actually, users' unreliable mental models were carried with little to no correction, as you see from this diagram. And then I was certain that, okay, yeah, but if they understood the technology, they would probably anthropomorphize less, right? So that was the second factor. And I was really kind of like looking forward to confirm at least that one. And, well, not at all. Actually, it was exactly the opposite. Basically, from the first diagram, the more users understood the backend technology, or they claim to have understood the backend technology, or they're, like, I don't know, hobbyist programmers or so on, the more they anthropomorphize it, which came as a massive surprise. And the only thing that actually panned out was that anthropomorphism did seem to increase with user satisfaction, and it was strongly correlated with user satisfaction, but it didn't work the other way around. So this means that, or it meant that what I was observing was actually more in line with theories of cognitive consistency rather than with a three-factor theory, which actually seemed to not work at all. And this was kind of further supported by looking at I did a word cloud analysis. And it seemed that participants that declared kind of like a higher satisfaction with their system used kind of like more personified terms or like slightly gentle terms such as smart or useful, whereas kind of a lack of understanding was more frequently associated with more objectifying terms such as tool or machine or functions such as lights for whatever reason. So what this means was that participants appeared to have anthropomorphized more when in fact they were merely kind of socially praising their agents to kind of alleviate any possible dissonance between kind of their declared satisfaction or understanding of a system and their evaluation of the AI, the AI's human-like traits, which were perceived as being positive. So that showed me that they were kind of like abiding by some sort of social norms, right? You personify something, you like how it kind of works, so you can't say bad things about it. And that meant that kind of like meant that they were already kind of employing very strong human-like schemas. And that's a critical distinction between the two kind of postulated types of behavior, because on one side, if anthropomorphism is a mindless reaction, then it means we're kind of like responding automatically to social cues, and we don't really have an umbrella for how to behave. Whereas if the second model is correct, so the ones that I was proposing was correct, then anthropomorphism would be the umbrella term for a bunch of human-like mental models, and that's person schemas, role schemas, and like even further down you had social schemas, which we know as stereotypes. And the difference is that in this case, mental models also come with very clear expectations, very clear scripts, and it's problematic to say the least. And this became obvious in my next experiment. Okay, moving on to failed assumption number 2. Is the artifact that primes human-like schemas? So looked at the AI. Right, so at this point, I really wanted to know whether what I was observing was indeed an automatic behavior or whether it was some sort of a human-like schema. And I did this experiment in which I designed this device and the AI agent, which was speaking with an Indian English accent. Keep that in mind. So in this experiment, I asked participants to play a game of activity with it, and you probably know the game. Some of you might have played it, in which I basically asked them to describe 6 modern buildings from around the world to the agent, being told that the device would try and guess it. In reality, it wasn't really doing that. That was just covering what I was really trying to measure, which is trying to figure out how participants were constructing their mental models of the device's presumed knowledge, if any. Right? So all I did was to actually measure the time they took to describe each entry. So in essence, I was trying to figure out whether people were subconsciously interacting with the device based on a pre-existent theory. And the results were concerning, because every single participant spent the least time describing the Indian landmark, because the agent had an Indian English accent. Meaning that they indeed estimated the knowledge of the device based on the type of persona it portrayed. So you're correlating an accent with a higher probability of identifying a building from a place of origin, whatever that means for an AI agent, right? But if you think about it, this has really further ethical repercussions going into kind of like areas of stereotyping and perhaps even conditioning harmful beliefs, which only complicated my research. Because it is implied that by simply adding kind of a dispositional trait such as an accent, it meant you are only reinforcing a certain social stereotype. Right. So at this point, I was certain that anthropomorphism was a not a mindless reaction, but rather a set of mental models that strongly resemble what we have of other people. But it was still very unclear whether it was identical to the mental models we have of other people or whether there are certain aspects in which it differs. And in order to test that, I loved complicating my life again by designing 2 other AI agents in which users had to play this game. It's called an animal guessing game, and it's based on an Alexa skill. I'm not sure whether you know the game, but basically you think of an animal and the AI kind of like asks questions until it guesses it, such as like, I don't know, does it have a tail? Is it blonde and dressed in black? I don't know, like, does it live underwater? So it asks all these questions until it guesses it. And I did 2 of these, and in one of the group, the agent was processing the information in a very opaque kind of like black box way in which was saying things like, oh, I'm having so much fun. This is such a great game. And in the second group, the AI would kind of give constant feedback on how he was processing the information. So it was like how he was narrowing down to the solutions. So this was like in a very robotic kind of transparent way. And then I asked participants to estimate the agent's ability to guess other 4 animals based on different levels of difficulty. And I have 3 more minutes. I have a lot more to say. Sorry, I just saw this on the screen. Right. Okay. So I think I can't remember what it was for. Like for easy, you had a squid, I think. For a medium, I don't know. Like for hard, you had like a pangolin or something. I don't know. It was like I had different animals for each of the difficulties. And this was done to kind of like assess whether participants' users' mental models were identical or different to to their estimations of another person's ability to guess the same animals. So I also asked them to estimate a hypothetical human's ability to guess the same animals. And as you see from the results, the graphs resemble each other, so they basically utilize very similar mental models, but they estimated the agent's ability to guess these games as slightly higher than that of another human being, and slightly more so in the robotic condition, so in the transparent condition. Okay, until now it's not necessarily surprising, but what was interesting is that it seemed that when it comes to factual knowledge, people trusted more the version which was detailing how the algorithms worked and interacted in a robotic way, but in the context of the game, it felt awkward and unfit for the situation, and they downright hated it. So, that was frustrating because I couldn't really come up with a theory of anthropomorphism that was fitting neatly into this like box of how anthropomorphism works. And I could just say, yes, anthropomorphism, no anthropomorphism. And yeah, that really kind of killed me. So I arrived at the conclusion that it's very hard to understand what really contributes to the dissonances in between kind of anthropomorphic expectations and the actual interaction. So eventually I realized that I had to study them together, but it was harder than I expected because I had no blueprint for how to do this. And at this point, it became kind of like a transdisciplinary approach in which I had to invent my own strategy or methodology that I soon realized I had to, just come up with, and I couldn't just be lazy. And so I did, and I created this, because I was studying dissonance, I decided I was going to kind of like repurpose Festinger's cognitive dissonance theory, which allowed me to look not only at the resulting action, but how this meaning was constructed in the interaction. And I started kind of like exploring the communicative choices or the interaction between the human and the AI and trying to identify these tensions. And what this means is that I was searching for to figure out how this meaning is contextualized in the interaction between the human and the AI. And because I was lazy, I really wanted to automate this. So I started kind of like inputting conversations into generative maps. And this is one of the initial concepts in which the AI's kind of like discourse is rendered in black and the human in white. And what's interesting about this one is that nobody understood anything, including myself. So it wasn't really useful. And then I kept coming up with like more illegible maps that I couldn't use. And because I was really essentially trying to condense a very sophisticated, complex phenomenon into interpretable topologies. And that's without avoiding to be kind of reductionistic. So anyway, I eventually arrived at bubbles. So kind of like exploring the potential of visualizing tension as locked away in more subtle aspects of language that were arising kind of like moment by moment in the interaction. So it's in essence trying to make something that is locked away trying to make something that's locked away in the aspects of like words or text as visible. So I end up developing this. I promise this is it. I just have 5 more minutes, 2 more minutes.
Q&A, so you'd use that to carry on.
Right.
Go straight to
Thank you. Okay, so I end up kind of developing this analysis software, which takes each exchange and turns it into a 3D object in space. And it sort of kind of highlights the structural aspects of conversation, such as on a local level. You've probably seen here duration, average pitch, kind of voice breaks, intensity. And on a global level, oh, I managed to catch up with my own video. It will be a very slowly loading Siri example. Yeah, here it highlights kind of like aspects of turn taking, overall sequence organization, asymmetries, pauses, lapses, and overlaps. So in essence, it was kind of like this topological mapping of both the local and the global structure of the interaction. And this was finally legible, I think. So the idea was that I was going to use this to analyze not only kind of users' deeply kind of embedded expectations of humanized agents, but also try to understand the points of tension that leads to kind of defiant interactions. And to propose better anthropomorphic models. So that without kind of thinking, oh, is this good or bad, but rather trying to understand it contextually. Oh, and this is my last slide. Thank you so much. I'm only 5 minutes over the limit.